All right, hello, and welcome to the Coach's Corner brought to you by the Endurance Lab, where you can join us, recap the week, and answer your questions from the forum. My name's Jason Flores, one of your Endurance Lab coaches, and today I'm joined by coaches Ian Murray, Mitch Dangermon, and our nutritional therapist. And we have a special guest today, but I'm going to leave it to Andrea to give a little quick introduction, and we're going to jump straight into the rapid fire questions. But I do want to thank our guests for coming today. So thank you very much. And Andrea, let's take it away.
You're landing me with the intro. I
Oh,
didn't
yeah.
expect that.
There you go. There you go. That's why we call it
Well,
live. All right.
and Andy is the person that I look up to for advice on hydration and electrolytes. And every
Absolutely.
time I have an athlete in my door, I'm like, go onto the website for
Hmm.
precision hydration and try that test. And then I'm trying to nudge them on to getting the proper test done. So, well, I just jumped straight into that little bullet round of short questions, and then we'll let Andy talk a lot more about his history with electrolytes and the journey and everything else. You
Yeah.
ready for this, Andy?
I think so.
They're generally pretty all right.
She's
So
mean.
I'm not mean. Don't listen to Ian. Place of birth.
So where do you work at this time is what the first question is. Where are you from?
Pardon?
Go,
Where are you from?
yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, I lost you guys for a second there.
Go ahead,
Go
Andrea. One
again.
more time.
So the first question was your place of birth.
Oh, my place of birth. I'm from Leicester in the Midlands in the UK.
First sport as a child.
Well, definitely soccer.
Ah.
And youth and team sports? Teen sports, beg your pardon. Teenagers.
Mostly soccer, I would say. And then I found out that I could run better without a ball at my feet. So,
Most of it.
so I left the ball behind and did some cross country running and a little bit of swimming.
Yeah.
Fab. Cross
Very
country
nice.
is brutal
Yeah.
in British weather.
Yeah,
I'll
no,
just add that in.
yeah, singlets and shorts, even in snow. I remember the good
Ooh.
old days.
Rough. Rough.
I
Rough.
like that rough California weather.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So coffee, yes or no?
Yes,
Mm,
daily, at least twice.
And,
nice.
and what's your favorite delivery method of that coffee?
Strong and black
No.
usually. I do like a bit of your American half and half though, which we don't have in the UK. So sometimes I
Oh,
have that when I'm
nah.
if I'm in the States.
Very nice.
Mitch takes his intravenously, so
Yes, yes. I'm sure his barista will be down in just a little bit to deliver his
Yeah,
next cup.
top them up.
So current sports that you're training in.
These days, I've been doing a lot of swim run, which is probably not huge in North America yet, but it's getting bigger. I think it's swimming between. It started in Sweden, swimming between islands and running across them. So that's been keeping me busy.
Oh,
Would love to be still riding my bike, but I've got two small children and a growing business, and finding time for bike riding is tough. So
oh
swim
yeah.
and run.
Oh no, that was my next question. So it's probably like on the wall in a prized place. Your racing bike brand is
Oh, the last one. I'm trying to think what I rode a last time I raced seriously. I think I rode a blue time trial bike.
okay.
Very
Yeah, I had
nice.
one of those.
Yeah, nice bike it was. I did a race across New Zealand, and it was just a tool for the job.
And how many bikes is the appropriate number of bikes to own?
Um, as many as you can fit in your garage.
Yeah,
There,
N plus one
oh,
is the
there we
correct
go.
answer.
Yeah.
I like
need a
it.
big garage. And are you a techie person? What training gadgets when you're racing and training do you use?
I would say I'm not especially techie,
Mm.
although I use a Garmin Phoenix to
Nice.
log absolutely 100% of all my training these days, and that's mainly because I find I'm fascinated by how much training I used to do, how much training I can fit into my life now, and the kind of relative difference in performance level. Because I've had to become extremely frugal with training. So
Mm.
in the build up from January to June this year, I worked it all out, for a race that I did, which is the race was about 5 hours long, I'd averaged 3 hours and 45 minutes of training a week, which was
Wow.
shockingly low, but found that, you know, my performance level, because of the type of training I'd done, was pretty encouraging. I was beaten up by the race because I wasn't as prepared for it with the volume mileage, but I'm really fascinated by all of that. So I would say I used gadgets, I used that, but I try to keep it as simple as possible with the data.
Wow, that's fascinating. And you're hitting on two of those questions, which is analyst or simplest. So now you're an analyst, but keeping it simple.
Simple. Simply an analyst.
I think what we try and do with precision hydration is that as well. It's definitely taking something which may be complicated in some respects, but if you're working with athletes, if you're an athlete yourself, you want simple actionable stuff. So make it simple, as they say, but not more simple than it needs to be.
Yeah, I like that.
Great point. Yeah. Racing, you have a lot under the belt between Ironmans. From what I've found out, Ironman 70.3, Xterra, Coast to Coast, and Otillo. So, what's your favorite discipline to train for and race?
Training. If I'm feeling good, is a good long run. I think that's therapy for me, as much as anything else. I had a great long run yesterday along the coast here, about 13 or 14 miles, and it takes me 2 or 3 miles to get into it, and then the head clears and away you go. So training that. Racing these days, I've actually got really into. I did an ocean swim the other day, and I've got quite into that. So I think I'm enjoying that more, because I feel as I've got an older, more fragile body now, I feel that's a sport where I can still push myself really hard. If I push myself really hard and try and run a fast 5K or something, something's going to break.
Yeah.
So you have to take a plane over, fly to a tropical area to swim in the ocean, and then you fly back right after it, because there's no swim in the ocean up there.
Yeah. From the photos we see, I don't know about swimming in the ocean out where you guys are at.
Yeah, we use a lot of we spend a lot of the budget on neoprene.
Yeah.
But we have less sharks.
Yeah.
Well, apparently.
We just have nicer sharks, or more aggressive sharks, I guess.
And your most memorable race?
Ooh, can I say two? Can I say
Sure.
two of those?
Sure.
I might start with. So my most memorable race from a purely indulgent, self-important point of view was I got on the podium at 70.3 when I was racing as a serious athlete, and for me I felt, even at the time, I was potentially punching a bit above my weight to do that, and was really proud of achieving that. I think the most memorable race I've done overall, though, is the race across New Zealand, the Coast to Coast race, which is paddling and mountain running and cycling and stuff, just because it is unbelievable what you see and what you experience in that race. It's so tough, but it's so, like, the river is, if you're not a great whitewater paddler, the river is scary as hell, and it's fantastic. It's a must do for any sort of endurance person.
Wow.
I think, at some point in their life.
Oh dear, I have some adventure athletes, and I think now that you've said that, this is going to be coming up.
Yeah. Sign them up.
Yeah, SOS.
Sorry, say again.
Have you gotten to do the SOS race?
No.
It's a swim run race here in the U.S. It's up in New York. I think it's in New York. It's supposed to be pretty big. It's that constant swim across the lake, run, swim across, and you got to carry your shoes with you, obviously. And
yeah. That sounds very cool. Yeah.
Oh.
No.
Put me onto that. I love traveling for a good race.
There you go.
It's a great way to see the world.
Do you travel much here to the States for work or racing, Andy?
Yeah, I'm usually 4 or 5 times a year in the US. So I think I've done 2-3 trips already this year. I'm over in about 4 weeks' time. Going to the west coast, actually. I'll be in LA for a couple of days.
Oh wow, I'd love to come by. I know there's a lot of places that are using kind of your theories and your program, so I'm sure you're visiting Orange County area and that sort of thing. You've got a couple colleagues down there, so that'd be great. Do you have anything else there, Andrea? We could jump questions. What do you got?
What? Oh no, these aren't as relevant now. Most peculiar food or drink eaten while racing?
It's a good one. I think it's probably whenever I go and do a trail race in Europe, I don't do them so much anymore, but they used to come up with some pretty crazy snacks on route. You know, you would definitely get like cheese and ham sandwiches and
Full meals.
yeah, basically just I don't know, prepared whole food. The one that you probably the one that you won't have heard of so much in the US. I've done a paddling race called the Devizes to Westminster, which is across the UK. It's 125 miles non-stop, and during the night we ate quite a lot of pork pies. So I don't know if you know what pork pies are, but they're very. It was cold and wet, and we had a lot of pork pies and cups of tea. Just
Wow.
because it was like, comforting, and someone had a big box of them, and they actually went down surprisingly well.
Interesting.
Yeah, that would have been a very high calorie demanding event. Your arms must have been falling off you by the end of it.
Yeah, I was, and also your where ass meets seat is not good in that event.
Along
And
real quick, Andrea, along those same lines, and maybe you're getting to this, maybe not.
no,
Thong,
you jump if it's on the theme.
thong, speedo, or jammers when you swim.
Definitely not thong. Predominantly speedo, I would say. Occasional jammers. Yeah.
Nice.
What's a
Okay.
jammers? Is that
Those
a
are-
long leg?
That's the long ones, yeah.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, so then when you're at the beach, thong, speedo, jammer, or board.
Board shorts
Ian.
for sure.
Okay.
Board. Yeah.
So I have 3
These-
daughters, so I like to
sure.
rock the Speedo at the beach.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Especially when he's
my-
out of shape.
Aw.
Come on, behave yourselves. I'll bring in a serious question. Your biggest lesson from sport?
Oh, perseverance. It's every overnight success story takes 10 years or more to build. Basically, keep at it.
Yeah.
The 4th P.
That's right. That is.
Much
That
so.
is. That is.
So that's the rapid fire done. We
Sounds
survived.
good. Sounds
Alright.
good.
Andy, you are an absolute wealth of knowledge. So we're all just really keen to hear about your journey with precision hydration and why is it so important for athletes to start considering electrolytes and all of their functions and not just hydration?
I think the whole story for me started with personal bad experiences as an athlete. So I was racing predominantly triathlon was what I took most seriously, and I would race predominantly in Europe and often in the UK where it's basically pretty cool most of the time. So I was never really exposed to racing in high temperatures. And when I started to venture a bit further afield and race either in Southern Europe or in the US or Asia, I would often fall apart in long races due to screwing my hydration up, because I would at the time drink a lot, often quite a lot of water, and that was because as a sports science student in the 1990s, we were taught that dehydration was a huge risk for athletes, and that basically more was better when it came to fluid consumption. Now, compounding that, for me, I have a very high sweat rate, so I'm probably about 150 pounds or 70 kilos, but I can sweat easily kind of 2 to 2.5 liters per hour when I'm going at it quite hard. I'm one of those guys, you don't want to be next to me in a spin class or something, because
Oh my God.
it's not good. It's not good for the bike or the general environment. So I have a high sweat rate, and therefore I put even more emphasis on replacing more fluids, and basically gave myself a mild case of hyponatremia, which is where you dilute your blood sodium levels down. It can be quite dangerous, and athletes have died from this on numerous occasions. I sort of then was looking into, okay, why is my performance suffering so badly? And I talked to a friend of mine who was a doctor, and he'd seen some photos of me in races and noticed the salt crystals on my skin and clothing. He said, we need to test your sweat, because I think you're losing a lot of salt as well as a lot of sweat. Now, even as someone who studied physiology, this had never been highlighted to me as an issue before. So I got a sweat test done at a hospital, and my friend said, your result will be really high, I reckon. And sure enough, we tested it. I was losing around about 90 millimoles of sodium per litre of sweat, which is about 1.8, 1.9 grams of sodium in every litre that I sweat out. And I was sweating out litres and litres. And he said, basically, this is the problem. What's happening is you're sweating a ton, you're losing loads of salt, you're not replacing it at a high enough rate, and over time your performance and your health is taking a dive. So we changed my nutritional regime up in races. I started at the time, all that was really available was, you know, the salt capsule, salt tablet type things. I just started taking a few more of those each hour in a race, and kind of trial and errored my intake in, and within a race or two it was like night and day. I was able to push in the heat, and it transformed the last few years of my training and competing, because I suddenly had kind of solved this problem.
So do you feel that electrolyte loss was affecting you more on a functional level than, so where, you know, cognitively and physically, down to, you know, how everything is actually working in the body, rather than what everyone will assume is, I'm losing salt, I'm going to get a cramp?
Yeah, very much so. For me, I was a big cramper, and I still can be if I don't get that side of things right. So that was a big red flag. And I know that the whole cramp and electrolyte thing is quite controversial, but I'm a big believer in the fact that it can be highly influential for some people. So I would definitely get cramps. I also suffered a lot from kind of a very fuzzy-headed lethargy, and sort of a bit like a feeling that was like a bonk, but not. And I certainly, it left me craving something, which I think, you know, looking back, was probably craving for salt. Whereas what I would try and do is try and correct with carbohydrates or fluids, because I thought I must be low on energy, I must be dehydrated, and none of that was particularly helping. So it would just, what I would start to see in long races was I'd feel, you know, great at the start, and then gradually there was a tailing off until a point where sometimes I'd just fall off a cliff. And I remember, you know, I did the Ironman in Hawaii, walked a lot of the run. I did the World Championship long distance triathlon in Nice in a very hot year, walked most of the run because of this. And then what I would always get the day after the race is I'd get cramps sometimes in the night, and then the next day I'd get a massive craving for McDonald's or some salty food that would kind of correct that. I mean, I remember flying back from the Ironman from Hawaii to Los Angeles, and Los Angeles to London. I didn't think I was going to be able to get on the plane in LA to get back to London. I felt so sick. Wow. It was just, I was really, really in bad shape. And I think I was actually, if I look back, I was probably quite ill at the time, but not quite. I hadn't figured out what I needed to do. So it was a lot of, I guess, basically, I was making a bad problem with my sweating worse by trying to counteract it with fluid overload, which then dug me an even deeper hole. So what got me interested in this then was, okay, I solved my problem as an athlete. Then I retired from competing properly and started working with other athletes, running a sports science lab. And I thought, I'm going to start testing people's sweat, because I'm interested to see if there's other people out there like me. And of course, we started testing people and finding, actually, there's a big range here. Some people lose a tiny amount of sodium in their sweat. Some people lose a really high amount of sodium in their sweat, and everything in between. Plus, there's big differences in sweat rates. So this then started to put a bit of a light bulb on in my head that actually all of these generic hydration recommendations, where people are getting recommended an average amount of fluid or an average amount of sodium, are very disputable, because although they may be the average, the deviation from that average is massive. And I was an outlier, an extreme outlier. So the advice that worked for me would definitely not work for everyone, but for me it was perfect. And that's where I think, you know, the whole question about hydration, electrolyte replacement and everything has become so controversial in sport, because you get people who say they don't think it's relevant at all. You get Tim Noakes and the South African contingent will say, just drink water when you're thirsty, you'll be fine, blah, blah, blah. And then you've got the kind of, it's been put on Gatorade's desk, a lot of this, you know, like the Gatorade sports science message of like, drink as much as you can, loads of carbohydrates, loads of salt. And the problem is, people are arguing about this kind of polarized thing, like, do you need loads or do you need none? And it's like, well, that's not the argument here. The argument is, what does an individual need?
Right.
and
Yeah.
also depending on what they're doing, because do we all need to be smashing bottles of Gatorade when we're doing a local 10K? Probably not. Is that the same as trying to perform at your best for 8 or 9 hours in Kona in like 95 degrees and 100% humidity? Well, no. There's a different question to ask. So I think basically we started to come at this hydration problem from an angle which said, okay, how do we individualize?
Mhm.
And the inherent problem with individualizing is you can't just blast the product out, stick it on the shelves, and tell everyone it's the greatest, because then you're creating yourself a dichotomy there. What you need to do is try and figure out how to get people to assess their own needs and then work out ways to meet them. And we're still very much sort of on that journey at the moment. At the moment, we have an online sweat test on our website, which is free, which a lot of people do to guide them into what their needs might be. We have a physical sweat test where they come and we take a sweat sample from them and test it. But in the future, I hope we'll have things like wearable technology that people can actually use when they're out riding or running or doing whatever it is they do, to look at their needs, look at their replacement, and then also match it to the performance that's coming out of their watch or wherever that's being measured, or their power meter. And I think that's a very exciting sort of part of the future for this part of performance analysis.
Yeah, I think that's what really sets you apart, is that you are trying to aim at the individual, where, as I come across often athletes that will have an experience, and then from their experience they will give recommendations to everybody else to do the same. And I've seen it, where they'll have a bad incident in a race that may actually be due to their kidney function and not actually over or under hydration at all. And they'll then tell everyone, you need to drink lots. And I'm like, no,
Yeah,
that can be harmful. But it's
definitely.
so interesting. I was racing in a race once and I started to feel low, and I was just hallucinating about a salt cellar. And then I thought this is so interesting. I made the connection in my body very quickly that low sodium actually can really feel like a hypoglycemic moment. And sometimes with athletes, I'll even tell them, when you're feeling that low, just take some salt and see how you feel.
Exactly.
Like, it's not the solution for how much they need to be taking, but it can be a real interesting lesson for them to understand the signals within the body about, what's wrong, and then go from there.
I think your point about instincts is really important, because a lot of the pro athletes that we work with are very, very tuned into their own bodies, and either by trial and error or experience and knowing, understanding what these instincts are, they do get things like electrolyte replacement, fluid replacement, calorie requirements. They get it right because they've got a database of experience, which they maybe even don't fully understand, some of them in their own head, but they know, if I'm feeling like this, I take this kind of food or this kind of drink, and it helps me correct. I remember talking to an athlete who's won the Hawaii Ironman a number of times and asking him about his electrolyte replacement, and he basically told me that he would carry an amount of salt tablets with him. The amount he would take on a given day would vary dramatically, but he would do it by listening to listening to how much his muscles were twitching, how he was feeling. He said a big sign for him was like his quads and hips tightening up early on the bike, because a sign he needed more salt. So he would take more tablets or less. Going back to your other point, though, about athletes extrapolating their own experience to enforce it on others, we sweat tested an athlete who came second in Kona, who's a phenomenally talented triathlete, who was giving experience to other athletes that, well, this whole story about electrolytes is all total BS. Don't worry about it. I've come second. I don't take any. I just drink this water and da da da. When we sweat tested her, very low sweat rate, very low sodium concentration. So,
Wow.
okay, that then becomes the N of one danger of, okay, I've figured out what works for me. And it's just what I get frustrated about is trying to have sensible conversations with people who have a very dogmatic view at one end of the scale or the other. We've had fantastic feedback from a lot of the athletes that we work with who come to us with a open-minded approach to solving their problem. But I've stopped doing it a lot these days, but you can get dragged into some debates on social media or on forums and things like that about with people who have a very extreme view, and it's frightening how there's not very much appreciation of this individualization and the nuances around that.
I can't believe
Andy, is it current thinking that it's genetic, the differences, or is it trainable? Is it conditioning? What's determining that we know of today?
Yeah, it's a good question. So sweat rate and sweat sodium concentration seem to be fairly independent of each other. So you can have a high sweat rate or a low sweat rate, a high sodium, low sodium, and those two don't correlate. What drives the basic sweat rate or the basic sodium concentration of someone's sweat is largely genetic. So you are kind of either born with high sweat loss and high sodium loss, or vice versa. That doesn't mean that you can't influence those things. So as you train and get fitter, especially in the heat, you tend to sweat more because that helps you to cool down. So you can elevate your sweating response. With sweat sodium, the opposite tends to occur. So the more acclimatized you get to a hot environment, the more dilute your sweat tends to get. But what's not clear is the magnitude of that difference and how that can vary with different people. So there are papers that have been written studying people where they've taken them as a normal controls, put them on a low sodium diet, then tested their sweat rates and sweat sodium concentrations after a period of acclimatization and seen reasonably dramatic reductions in their sweat sodium. We don't tend to see that as much in the athletes we retest, I think, because athletes live in a state of partial acclimatization most of the time because of the volume of training they do. So what we tend to say to athletes these days is, look, if we do a sweat test and figure out what your sodium concentration is, it's kind of like a plus minus, you are in that zone. It might be a bit higher at some times of the year, or some days it might be a bit lower at others, but ballpark figure for you is this. It's a bit like the behind the shirt sizes thing. We're trying to categorize someone as being small, medium, large, or extra large, not 1,051 milligrams per liter versus 1,058 milligrams per liter, because that is inherently insignificant to them in terms of what replacement they might need to take.
Sorry.
That's all right. One of the things too I've seen, and if you want to comment on it or what your thoughts are, the difference of like athletes who are training long distance and occasionally go do a shorter distance event. So like guys and ladies who are doing Ironman or half Ironman or marathons, going down and doing that 10K or the 40K time trial, for example, their needs change on that kind of races because the intensity is different, the duration is different. And one of the things I've seen is people who try to follow the same hydration electrolyte plan, but it's either unnecessary or overkill.
I think that generally speaking, when we talk to athletes who are engaged in short events or team sport events, we put a lot of emphasis on pre-event hydration. So you want to get on the start line or at the start of a game topped up and ready to go, not having overdone it, but also certainly not depleted and behind. And then we talk about a lot about recovery hydration, because if you've got to go out and perform later that day or the next day, that becomes important. But the during element for anything short is, I would never tell an athlete not to drink if they felt like they needed to drink during an event, but I would be hesitant. My general advice is that, look, if you're doing stuff which is less than an hour, it's the effect of fluid is likely to be more psychological than physiological. So if you're on a bike, then I would always say to people, look, if you feel more comfortable doing it, have a bottle of something on there which you can sip on, but don't think that that's going to make the significant difference. You got to basically show up hydrated. I think I ran my sort of 15 miles yesterday with a drink at the start and a drink at the end. And no, that was not a race or anything, and it was pretty hot. I may have stopped and had a very quick splash from a tap along the seafront or whatever on the way because I felt like it. But then what I noticed yesterday evening, because it was a relatively hot day in the UK, yesterday evening I was just like regularly, I must have put away 4 or 5 12-ounce cups of water and stuff with my dinner, and I just kept, and it was just like going in and nothing was coming out, so it kept going in, and that's what you find with most athletes is if you learn to trust your instincts, you'll normalize over a 24-hour 48-hour period. That's actually what matters. Replacing 100% of your losses or even a large percentage of your losses during a short session, I don't believe is incredibly significant. Unless, of course, you are doing multiple sessions a day, and then you don't want to get quite dehydrated in session one because you've not got many hours to catch up.
Mm.
So
Makes
it's
sense.
all about that combination of individual strategy, but also looking at individual demands of what your event is.
And then
I-
on top of that, you just mentioned, sorry, Andrew, one last thing, then I'll let you get it because I know this is probably the most important thing that I'm going to ask about for today. When you're having those sessions, when you're feeling that, you know, you're getting back and you're drinking the water and you're just getting thirsty, do you recommend substituting a margarita or two for one of those cups of water to add that extra salt intake?
A bit of a, was that a margarita or so? Definitely recommended, especially with the little salt ring
Yeah,
around the
yeah,
edge.
it's like-
Then if that tastes good, then you need the salt. Yeah, for sure.
You got to try it for sure. So you mentioned the sweat test and kind of how it works, the two different ways, and you also mentioned like the pre, the during, and post. I guess from the analysis that us as coaches get for our athletes, what are we looking for to be able to like make recommendations or point people in the right direction of what to do with all the different things that people are hearing, like you were talking about the polarized and everyone's kind of all over
Yeah.
the place. Yeah, with your product
I-
specifically, yeah.
I would say that's one of the reasons why we designed this online sweat test, because
Mhm.
we started off wanting to sweat test properly every athlete that we
Yeah.
worked with. That was our goal, because then you can sit down with them, you can do the thing. But unfortunately, that's very, very hard to scale to a degree that makes it viable from a business point of view.
Mhm.
Also, it's very limiting because only the people willing to travel to you or who we could travel to could do it. So we took a lot of the data that we got from our early testing. We built this online algorithm which asks people questions about what they're doing, and then it will spit out what we call like a ballpark recommendation, and that'll include. So it starts with what they should do pre-exercise,
Mhm.
and the basic mantra there is
Like this. My printout.
you got to
It's brilliant.
start hydrated.
Yep.
And the way to do that is not just to pound loads and loads of water. You probably, if you're doing something very hot, hard, high intensity, it's a good idea to drink a little extra more. But our recommendation for that is to use quite a strong electrolyte drink in a relatively small quantity. So something like 16 ounces of a very strong electrolyte drink about an hour to 90 minutes before you do an activity is a really good way to make sure that your tanks are topped up, and the extra electrolytes help you absorb the fluid into your bloodstream and hold it there rather than it just sitting in your stomach or you just peeing it out. Then during the activity, it's massively dependent on the duration, the intensity, and the heat stress as being the key factors. So like I was saying, anything under an hour, I would normally say, look, drink to thirst if at all, and don't worry about it. You'll catch up afterwards. The grey area then starts like hour to 2 to 3 hours. You can, I think some athletes especially can punch out some pretty long sessions without drinking. Whether that's it may not be detrimental to their performance in that session, but it may then start to have knock-on effects later on. So we tend to be more encouraging of them drinking in that. Beyond sort of 2 hours if it's hot and 3 hours if it's temperate, then I think fluid replacement really is highly influential on actual performance. And then we start to make some recommendations around fluid volume, and that could be saying, look, at the lower end, some athletes will drink 200-300 milliliters per hour. Some might drink up to 1,000 milliliters an hour, a liter an hour, which is about 64 ounces or so. But that's at the higher end, and not a lot of athletes go beyond that. We do work with some extreme athletes, either really big guys in the NFL or the NBA who are just so massive that we scale things up because they're losing so much more. Or we've got a few little guys in the Tour de France and things like that who have very high metabolic rates, who are sweating a ton, and they might, for short periods, might drink, 75, 80 ounces an hour and that kind of thing. But that's the exception, not the rule. So we try and give people a bracket to work in, and that's what the report does. And then post-exercise, it's like, okay, there's no harm in starting with the exact reverse of what you did beforehand, which is a strong electrolyte drink, 16 ounces or so in the hour or so after you finish, because that's going to help you to absorb and retain more fluid. And then beyond that, it's kind of just listening to your body, rehydrating. Last night I had one of our own products. When I finished the run, I had a pH 1500, which is a salty the strongest electrolyte drink we do. But after that, I just got the salt shaker out with my meal, salted it up, and drank lots of water. Because when that salt, after, especially if I find post-exercise, when you can't really taste the salt on the food, that's when you kind of know when you need it most. And then as you eat more and more of it, it becomes saltier and saltier to the point where you start thinking, oh, this doesn't taste so good anymore. That's when you know you've had enough.
Hmm.
It's interesting. I load my food with salt, and I've never felt it's a bad thing, because there's, we've been given all the wrong information about hydration. Drink, water, water, water. And we've been told salt is really bad for you. So
Yeah.
some athletes afraid to use an
Yeah.
electrolyte because of hypertension, which is actually totally untrue.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
it's just interesting. Practically speaking, say someone in a cooler climate like Britain or Ireland gets sweat tested, and so they sort of know what their sweat levels are and how to manage that where they live, and they travel out to like Europe at the moment. Racing in Europe, they have a massive heat wave.
Yeah.
Or if you go to Kona, things are going to change, but you're going to have to make sort of intuitive tweaks. Now, I would feel you're just upping your fluid volume with that same amount of electrolyte per hour. Would that be correct?
I think the classic thing that people actually do in that scenario is quite often they will overshoot. They'll if they've not got experience of, say, going like Frankfurt this weekend just gone was like
Yeah.
super hot.
Yeah.
And there's been an interesting study done in Frankfurt for between, I think it was 2005 2013. They took lots of blood samples from people at the finish line, and they found that 10% of the finishers were hyponatremic. So through a combination of over drinking and under salting when they were racing. So I think that one of the because you guys are all in coaching and advising athletes. If you tell athletes that X will improve their performance, then what they will try to do is like 5x.
Yeah.
Yes.
So drink more to an athlete means like, okay, I'm going to go and like really drink more. I'm going to not stop drinking until and so I think what we always do tend to advise people, look, when you go to a hot climate, you're going to have to increase your fluid intake for sure. You may have to increase your salt, but it's in step with that. Like you were saying, Andrew, the ratio probably stays fairly similar, but it's not just a case of like suddenly doubling or tripling. It's a case of feeling your way into it, obviously giving yourself time to experience it, adequately prepare. I would always encourage athletes who are in a cool climate. There are ways, fairly cost-effective ways of simulating the heat, whether you can actually go to a place with a climate chamber, or whether it's more likely you just shut yourself in your pain cave with a heater on or whatever, and get the temperature of it and start to figure out what it feels like and what your fluid needs are like when you're closer to that exact temperature, because then you can get confidence in your plan. On our website there's a spreadsheet that you can download to punch numbers into about how much weight you've lost during certain sessions versus how much fluid you've taken in. And if you do that over enough sessions, you start to build up this kind of mental trend in your mind. Okay, well, when it's 30 degrees and I'm pedaling at 220 watts or whatever, I tend to sort of lose about this much and feel good if I replace about this much. And I always discourage people from looking for the one size fits all or the holy grail answer to this. It's like, go out and try these things within sensible parameters and figure out what works for you, basically.
And do you feel, so an awful lot of places write about this 2% rule, whereas they forget on a long course Ironman in a hot environment, you're not only going to dehydrate some, you're losing weight from your body from lost glycogen stores.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm never worried if it's 2, 3, 4% even, and I know there's some stats where it's even going up to 7%. So is the most important thing for you, like, what clinical observations, how is that athlete actually feeling in correlation to the data that you have and taking a look at their plan? This is where it's always good working with someone like you or someone who knows their stuff, because you're looking at everything, not just a data point which says 3%.
Yeah, I think that those, like exactly what you've identified there, the outliers in the data are Haile Gebrselassie losing 10% of his body weight during a world record attempt at the marathon, where he ran very fast, and it's been proven that some people can tolerate that sort of weight loss through combination of glycogen depletion and extreme sweat loss, and for an acute period of time not see any performance decrement. On the flip side, you do see some people whose performance starts to degrade at 2% body weight loss. That, I think, a big factor in that is starting hydration status, because if you're already starting a little bit behind, then 2% loss could be significant, because what is you hydrated? It's a moving target the whole time. The figures that you've just talked about there, 3, 4, 5% body weight loss, I think are very normal. And I think, I would definitely not be concerned or to see athletes losing that amount of weight during a longish endurance event. The biggest factor though is like repeated experience of saying, well, if we've seen this person starting to fall off a cliff beyond X% of the body weight loss, then we need to put a plan in place that keeps them from the edge of that cliff. And I think the biggest challenge in all of this actually comes in the middle to long endurance events in the heat. So typically, if you've got short events, we're not worried, because the magnitude of sweat loss or weight loss during a period of time is constrained, and it's just not going to be a problem. If you go into the really, really long events, the really, really long ultras, the pace that people are moving at and the availability of fluids and food and that sort of thing means that the ability to take on sufficient to replace what you're losing is a bit easier. You'll see people in 100-mile ultras and stuff eating a lot of food, stopping to walk through aid stations and drink. I think the real problematic sweet spot for this is like in triathlon terms with the half Ironman and full Ironman, where the fast people are going at a very high percentage of their maximum effort for a very long period of time, often in very extreme conditions. So, and if you're Jan Frodeno and smashing through the run at 6 minutes a mile or whatever, you're not stopping for long at these. You're not stopping at all probably at the aid stations to drink and that. So there's this, and your heat production's a lot higher, so your sweat rate's a lot higher. So it's actually then figuring out what these in those middle events, you're trying to figure out the lowest minimum effective dose of everything you can take on to get around in good shape. So, for instance, in Ironman, we often spend a lot of time talking to people about being more proactive about what they drink and eat on the bike, because we know it's going to tail off on the run. So that's a really good example of where you deviate from this kind of Tim Noakes drink to thirst approach. I spoke to Tim Reed about this, who's just won Ironman 70.3 Coeur d'Alene at the weekend. Tim's a big sweater, and we've been helping him try to unpick some of the associated issues with that. And he's a big believer, and I support him in this, is in drinking to a plan in the first half of his events. Then he sort of flips a bit more onto how he feels, but he just says on the start of the bike and the first week, he's settling in. The fight or flight response is strong. His mind's focused on tactics and racing. He's got a dry mouth because he's nervous, but he doesn't know whether that's dehydration. So he just drinks to a plan until he gets to a certain point, and then lets things take over, and that's honed in. And that sort of blended approach based on hard-won experience and a little bit of scientifically based trial and error is ultimately, I think, the best way for people to figure out what they actually need.
Yeah. Well, and that goes to a lot of, I think, for especially with athletes who are pushing themselves or athletes who are new, taking away their decision-making authorities until a certain point is actually fairly effective. Well, it's effective because they don't have to think about it. It's kind of like laying out, if you lay out your clothes and you know what you're going to do, and everything's in a checklist, you don't have to think. And if you don't have to think, it's less energy, less brain power you got to put to it, and you can focus just on what you're doing. And when you're at the point of like a Tim Reed, I mean, tactics matter at that level. Yeah. So not having to think about, should I drink now? Should I not drink? I don't know. Maybe I should eat. Maybe I shouldn't. Getting rid of that crap is a lot of energy that he doesn't have to spend, and he can just say, all right, that guy's going to blow up on the bike, or he's a crap runner, I can let him go.
100%. And I think you've hit a really important point there, which is different strategies for different levels of athletes. So if we got a complete novice, we've talked a lot about experienced athletes knowing their bodies incredibly well, but how many of you as coaches would send a novice athlete off into an Ironman situation or something without a heart rate monitor or a power meter or something and just say just go at it,
just
because
wing it.
just wing it, because at the end of the day, there's no perfect science of telling someone how much power to ride and what heart rate to hold. But you build up a really good database of experience with this athlete. You do some tests and things, and then you go, right, I reckon let's peg it at X watts for the first period of time, because we know that is compatible with whatever our goal is in this race. Why people don't do that with nutrition sometimes, I have no idea, because a lot of people's attitude to nutrition is largely wing it, or at the other extreme, rigid plan, which is so rigid, I'm going to keep eating even if I'm feeling sick, eating these or whatever, I'm going to keep eating them. Even if I'm feeling bloated, drinking all this fluid, I'm going to keep drinking, and we need to just, this idea of a flexible plan is not easy to communicate, and it takes time to refine, but none of that I think should be too off-putting for people who actually want to progress with their performance. It's just another thing you've got to learn through experience.
Oh yeah.
So with the precision hydration product, obviously we're talking about on the hydration end, different levels of electrolytes, and pretty low on carbohydrate sides from what my experience, from what I see. So the other part of it, getting carbohydrates, I would say, from solid foods, as we've been talking about. That's, you're a proponent of all that kind of hydration in our bottles and getting food otherwise.
Well, ham sandwiches and pork pies. Obviously.
Yeah, obviously. There you go.
Yeah. Again, I think largely, if I had to sort of throw my hat in the ring, and I don't like, I definitely don't like being dogmatic about things. There are definitely a place for liquid calories and carbohydrates in sport, especially in shorter events, more high intensity stuff. I will put my hand up to say that I'll take our own products and mix them double strong, in terms of take a lower electrolyte strength and mix them double strength for when I'm doing something short and intense, because I want more calories and less electrolytes. That said, in general, my response to sort of how do you fuel and hydrate is the, I know Alan Lim pretty well from Scratch Labs, and Alan and I definitely agree on this, like hydration in your bottles and salts and calories in your pockets, because that way you can dial them up and down separately. It seems to work better. Definitely hypotonic fluids, so with very little calories in, are absorbed quickly. And I would say for long duration exercise in the heat, it's a no-brainer for me. It's predominantly calories in foods and gels, and liquids and salts in your bottle. The shorter, and like I say, the shorter and faster the events, or the colder the conditions, especially Andrea in Ireland or the UK, I've done paddling events down rivers where not only is it more difficult to eat solid foods because you can't take your hands off the paddle, but you just don't need much fluid because you're not sweating, but your energy burn is off the charts. So I've drunken like flat Coca-Cola with a little, just diluted down a little bit and things like that, because that's just the big caffeine sugar hit that keeps you going. So I think it's that kind of approach.
So in the bottles, where we're talking just enough sugar to help with absorption, and then dialing in that salt depending on the product, the 500, the 1,000, or the 1,500 for your needs. It sounds like that's perfect. Okay, that makes a lot of sense for us and the athletes. And
it takes a while to get used to I have the 1,500 and the 1,000.
Yeah. It's not a little bit of salt, not a little bit of salt.
You are like, oh, I'm thirsty here. So it just takes a little bit of time to get used to. But I'd be a low fluid volume sweater, high salt. Although I do want to get to George in Ireland and just confirm that to myself. I think the value in knowing, I just think is, and you just have to do that test once. Like you have the dial point to move it around then. And I know a lot of athletes can be very headstrong and stubborn and feel they want to figure it out themselves. And I'm like, but it just reduces decision fatigue. Just find out some set points for various things. And then you don't have to think on that one then. You sort of know what you're at.
Yeah, I agree. I think, from us, if I put my business commercial head on, then being able to test an athlete every few weeks would be really great, because you can charge them for it. But it would be disingenuous to do that. With this is kind of basically a one-time test, and then off you go and use that information. And it's, At first, we were very, very tempted off the back of the testing because people came to us and said, "Oh yeah, no, you guys know what you're on about with hydration. You can do this test. You can tell me exactly what I need to do." And we tried to build reports for people that were really specific and told them really exactly what we thought we should do. But then we realised that actually that test is part of the picture, but there's a lot of other variables involved, like what they're eating, what else they're drinking. Subtleties in the environment that they're working out in, all the and probably other physiological variables we just don't understand at this point. So we've now become a lot more circumspect in being exact, and it's more about putting people in the right zones, because where hydration goes wrong is your body's so good at self-correcting. If you give it roughly the right amount of calories, fluids and salts when you're exercising, it will sort all of that out for you. Where it goes wrong is if you take vastly the wrong amount. Now, when I was doing Ironman, I moved from when I did Kona, I think, working backwards, I probably was taking less than 300 or 400 milligrams of sodium per hour in my original plan. In later Ironmans where I had a lot more success, I was taking between 1100 and 1500 milligrams quite often per hour on the bike, which just found to be the sweet spot, and it was just allowed me to power on. And so that's the kind of resolution we're talking about, is like, getting it 5 times wrong is bad. Getting it within a handful of percent, you'll be absolutely fine.
So as people get tested, or people start off with the online test, obviously you guys have got your product. I guess the question comes up, if people have like a hydration plan that they're following, do you guys review that and adapt to that, or is it a complete switch over to those products to be able to kind of go with the testing numbers that you guys are finding?
No, we're very open to helping people, build on what they're already doing, especially if they've had a degree of success with it.
Makes sense.
Sometimes it's good to wipe the slate clean if people are screwing it up, or if people have lost confidence in what they're doing. It's kind of like, okay, let's walk away from that, and we'll start something new. So we have a fantastic crew in the PH office. We've got James, who's the head of our customer comms team, and James is a very accomplished triathlete himself. He's a sports scientist, and he answers pretty much all of the emails that come in on a daily basis from people who've had a sweat test or are thinking about having one, who've got a product question. So it's a big area of our business where we've tried to be very, very different to the rest of the industry. We will email the big players in the sports nutrition space on a regular basis to see what kind of responses we get to our technical questions, and the answer is like either just some very bland generic guidelines or no response at all. When people email Precision Hydration, and if anyone wants to, it's just hello@precisionhydration.com. They'll get an answer from a real qualified human being. We can't promise that we'll solve all of their problems, but we will answer promptly and in depth. And so we're happy to, that's a big part of what we do, so we're very happy to hear from people.
I think it'd be interesting to see you guys go down for the Keys 100. It's a ultra race, starts in Key Largo, goes down to Key West, and the interesting part is they have a 100 mile individual, 50 mile, 50K, but they also have a team event. And I've done the team event a couple times. It's 6 runners, and you swap off every 2 miles except for the 7 mile bridge. And wow. I've had people I work with who've done the 100 miler, the 50 miler, but like I said, I've done the team, and I found it's wildly different what everyone has to take. So we did a team event, you're running 2 miles, but you're going full gas for 2 miles, right? But then here's the kicker of it: you sit in a hot van, you roll to the next point to pick up the next person. So it's like you're not going to leave the van running with. I mean, you can run with the AC, but you got to get out and move around. So you're standing, sweating, and you never. But people forget about that, and I was a victim of it once too, where I just forgot. Hey, I took some water in, I took some electrolyte drink in, but then I was sweating for the next 45 minutes waiting for my next turn to run again, or even longer, hour 15. It's not hot, a lot of sweating, but it's light sweating, and you're in sweaty clothes, and before you know it, all of a sudden you're down. In my case, I think I was down like 6 pounds. Of sweat, and you can't eat much when you're running just over 5 minute miles, and then you stop, and then just over 5 minute miles, and you stop, and it's about 1,000 degrees out there. Yeah, it's horrible. And the good thing is there's not a cloud ever.
Not a
Yeah.
cloud ever.
So it's full sun, and you're running on the road too.
Yeah.
So
But it sounds like we need to come out and do a kind of some kind of scientific study here and do some
I think so.
measurements and maybe tag on a week either side for a vacation.
Yeah.
Well, I think it would be interesting for you guys to do a study on both team and individuals to see
Yeah.
that how the difference of what you have to take as an individual running that 100-miler and dealing with those elements, vice the fast team runners who are just hammering it.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Well, I think, and the fast team runners, I think they're actually, from a physiological point of view, to an extent, having a rougher time of it because what you're asking the body to do is, really go to the max, go to the extreme, recover and go again. And in the heat, the faster you run, it's the speed of running that's the problem, not the duration. Like humans are pretty good at keeping going in the heat because you just moderate your pace. But when you're gunning it, we once did I was the organizer of an attempt to break the world record for how far a team of 12 could run on a treadmill for 48 hours. So
Ooh.
Why?
exactly. It was long story, but it was a bit of a niche thing. We did it at a big festival in the UK called the Goodwood Festival of Speed, and the theme was endurance. So we were doing this thing. It was on TV. It was quite cool, but the guys were fit guys. They were running, give or take, they were running at around 5 minutes a mile on their stints, and they were doing about 20 minutes a stint or so, and then switching over, and then round the clock. But during the day, it was hot for the UK. It was like 80 some degrees, and it was like the biggest problem we had was people overheating. In the end, we stood them in a big tall trash bin full of icy water.
Oh wow!
Just to get their core temperature down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to try and manage that. But hydration, they were like drinking everything in sight. And when is that race?
It's in May. It's usually first or second weekend of May. So like I said, it's really awesome to watch people from the north come do it. Destroyed.
Yeah.
But no. So the last time I did it, I had to run the 7-mile bridge portion of it. And I think it was like 92 degrees, like full sun and like 80% humidity when I started.
Ian volunteered to run the bridge.
I did, well, because I was the fastest one on the team. So, and I wanted to hurt people.
He also volunteered to run everyone else's leg as well.
Well, I ended up running 22 miles that day
man.
I genuinely think we could brainstorm some ideas to do some interesting testing around that. I'd love to see some of the body weight loss data, and we could do some sweat sodium readings. So
That'd be really interesting.
Shoot me an email on that one.
Okay. I've got another place we can do some testing, but I'm pretty sure you're not going to go out there.
We just can't tell anybody where he's going.
Yeah.
So I guess one thing that's kind of crossing my mind, I know a lot of us have athletes that we work with that have kids. You also have kids. Does this sort of advice go towards our younger athletes the same way it does for an adult? Kind of, have you tested younger athletes in the same worlds?
Yeah, we've tested adolescent athletes of different ages. We haven't got much data yet on repeat testing these kids because I've always been hesitant to go out testing too many children. One, because I think there's very few sports where kids are doing enough volume of training and losing enough volume of sweat to make it significant. And just without digressing too far, I'm not a big believer in this kind of like early specialization stuff with sport and throwing adult level sports science and coaching at kids because it sends a lot of the wrong messages. That said, we do get approached by, predominantly I would say it's in tennis where we get approached by people because these kids start young, they specialize early. A lot of them train in Florida and places where it's hot, so we have been chucked some interesting cases there. There are no great guidelines out there, but what we basically try to do is use our common sense and say, look, okay, we'll test these kids, we'll see we'll try and estimate their sweat outputs, we'll use the sodium concentration that we know at the time to factor into that. But in actual fact, do we know much about what happens longitudinally? I'm not really sure. There is some evidence, I believe, to suggest that in general, sweat sodium might go up a little bit over your lifetime, so older people might have, but I think we're talking about a small amount of increase. What happens, I'm pretty sure on the basis that obviously a lot happens to sweating and sweat response as you go through adolescence, because you don't sweat much before and then you start to sweat a lot because the sweat glands kind of get turned on.
Mm-hmm.
Then I can only hazard that there would be some potential changes, but I'm not sure what they would be, to be totally honest with you.
Makes sense. Yeah.
That's interesting. Actually, that's making me wonder about, so the one sport that the youngsters are into quite extreme at a young age is swimming.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they're should we be getting them on, like a lot of them aren't even drinking enough at all. And I know they're cooler in the water, so you're not really sweating as much, but there must be
Yeah.
some chronic daily electrolyte depletion going on for these youngsters. And electrolytes are important for everything in the body.
I think those kind of kids, the kids that are doing these extreme training loads at a young age, are probably more at risk from things like energy deficiencies and fluid and electrolyte depletion. I'd always be hesitant to give the kids overly strong electrolyte drinks and things for no other reason than if they're doing okay with what they're doing at the moment, I wouldn't want to go interfering and giving them something vastly stronger, especially with the real youngsters. Their kidneys and things are still developing. I don't have enough knowledge to kind of strongly advise it. On the flip side, I don't think I could see any harm in them using electrolyte replacement type drinks if they are doing, because a lot of these swimmers, are doing 2 hours of swimming in the morning and the evening, and stuff like that. It's a considerable amount of energy output and activity. I still think, based on my own, I guess not particularly scientific knowledge of it, the biggest thing for these kids would be calorie intake, because they are just, I know what it's like. If I go I don't do it very often, but if I do a 90-minute swim session in the morning or whatever, people best not leave any food lying around the office. It's getting hoovered up. So that's obviously a big thing, making sure they're still growing and developing. But yeah, it would make intuitive sense that they're going to be sweating when they're doing this. So having something more than just plain water in their bottles could well be advisable.
Makes sense.
I've one more question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
We all work with athletes, so we're going to come across some athletes that have, I know the term adrenal fatigue isn't great, or overtraining syndrome. And from what I know within functional medicine is there tends to be a greater need for electrolytes in chronically ill people that have, say, chronic fatigue syndrome. So is there a call for slightly more electrolytes in maybe athletes that are going through overtraining syndrome, or have you seen anything in your own line of testing?
I have actually. I've seen, there's a very, very interesting case study from a German lady, which I'll send to you. It was published, I can't remember which journal it was published in, a few years ago now, of an endurance athlete who became sodium depleted, and it was shown to be responsible for her overtraining syndrome, basically.
Wow.
So she was, and this was a typical scenario that I've seen probably a handful of times now, with someone who is very diligent about eating a low sodium diet because they're a healthy person and eat a lot of whole foods and consciously try to minimize sodium input, whilst at the same time doing a lot of training. And they were actually depleting sodium at a cellular level and sodium reserves in the body, because presumably the body was scavenging this sodium to balance blood sodium levels, and it was making them pretty ill. When they reverted and put significant sodium supplementation back into their diet, the overtraining syndrome problems went away. So I don't by any stretch use that as an example to sort of make out that most overtraining is to do with electrolyte depletion, but I think it's a factor. Or it can be a factor. I know definitely from my own experience, when I look back in the summertime when I was training really, really hard, I would get a lot of episodes of low blood pressure standing up, the postural hypertension, where I'd be there lying down watching MTV Cribs between my training sessions, and then stand up all of a sudden and feel dizzy, and that was always a sign to me. I always took that as a sign that I was like on the edge with my training. But looking back, it's probably as simple as that was just not enough sodium and fluid because I wasn't keeping my blood pressure up. So I think it's certainly another area which is kind of worth investigating. I think I'd have to reread the paper, because I can't remember whether this was the case or not, but I have a feeling that when they did the blood tests on this lady, her sodium levels in her blood were fairly normal because the body was protecting
Of
those,
course,
but
yeah.
it was at the expense of sodium at a cellular level. So
Wow.
even with a regular blood test, it wasn't showing up hypernatremic because chronically the body had adapted to it. It was
Mhm.
just that when she went to exercise, she was having all sorts of problems. But yeah, as I
So
say,
if I'm just thinking out of the box here. So I have a body composition machine that will look at intracellular and extracellular fluid volume. Like, is there any indirect marker there? So if I see someone with a low intracellular fluid volume, there can be many factors, but could low sodium be involved? I haven't got my science
potentially,
hat on.
although I think most obviously the predominant intracellular electrolyte is potassium. So
Potassium, yeah.
Mhm.
potentially potassium levels be more correlated with that. The only other thing that I've read as well is that although the like bioelectrical impedance type devices can give you an
Yeah.
estimate of those fluid levels, they're not necessarily accurate to that degree. So I don't know whether that would be a valid measurement of that or not. But again, it's like anything. I think having lots of these data points, measuring them on a number of occasions alongside performance data, alongside kind of other markers of recovery and fatigue, you might start to see some interesting correlations, which then I definitely used to see, if I was trying to lose body weight, then it was good to lose body weight in a sort of small linear way with it. But if I saw large fluctuations in body weight, that was often associated with temporary decrements in my performance or fatigue or whatever, because of inadequate glycogen replacement and fluid replacement. That's why these days, because I very infrequently train hard, I'm a lot more diligent when I do train hard to
Make sure.
increase my intake, basically, so that I can hopefully recover a bit faster.
So you're definitely not a keto athlete then.
Oh no. But that's another great debate, isn't it, in sport, like the hydration one,
man.
where you have to be in one camp or another. There's no meeting in the middle ground. Like, I fully can put my hand up and say I used to eat way too much in the way of carbohydrate because it was shoved down my throat that was what you did as an athlete. It was just pasta all the way. But even so, nowadays I was very curious about the whole low carb thing for a while, and obviously the argument is if you don't try it for long enough you won't know. But anytime I've tried going really aggressive with that, it's just not good.
Yeah.
So
and all the elite athletes that we work with, they all eat a lot of carbohydrate, to support training. Maybe they don't when they're not training so hard, but when you're training hard,
You got to.
So just to clarify, you don't recommend a major diet shift 3 months out from your race, like something small like Kona World Championship, something like that. You don't recommend a major diet increase.
I would be shifting onto the kind of like the grass-fed butter diet just a few months before Kona. No,
It could be challenging. All right, Andrea. Anything else? Any quick last questions around about anyone? We're good. All right.
No, this has been brilliant.
It has. I want to thank Andy for coming on today. For everyone listening, and I'll make sure that we post a link to, of course, Precision Hydration website, as well as that self-test that you can get started with and get some information so that you have that printout in front of you when we talk today. A lot of the coaches here have done it themselves. We've recommended to athletes as well. We'll make sure we post a link to that. If you have any other questions, follow up, we can try to post them here in the show notes, and we'll try to collect them all and we can get them connected. Also want to thank everyone for joining us today, the coaches, Andy, here in the Coaches Corner. And if you like what you hear and we would love for you to share this out to your friends if you find this interesting. And if you have any questions, let us know, and you can send us an email at coaches@endurancelab.fit. Don't forget that we are also on Facebook at Endurance Lab and Instagram at The Endurance Lab. And don't forget, we'll see everybody every other week here on the Coaches Corner. Again, thanks to all the coaches, and Andy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, guys. Brilliant chat.
Thank you, guys.
Really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thank you.